We did everything just the way grown-ups would have. Why didn't it work?
I was probably like 13 years old. My older sister mentioned some book she'd had to read in school about a bunch of boys stuck on an island. She said that they went crazy, split into groups, and fought each other. At some point after that, I sought the book out and read it as a freshman in high school, even though I knew that it was going to come up next year in 10th grade. But I figured that was okay because I would just look smarter, and thought maybe this might offset some of my bad behavior. Anyway, that book was, of course, Lord of the Flies. I remember reading it for a second time in May of my sophomore year, finishing it on a beach at sunset. Thanks to all of the insight from my sophomore English teacher, it was like reading the book for the first time again. Lord of the Flies came up for me next about 4 years later, in my second year of college, when my sociology professor used it as an anchor text in his class. Once more, it was like I had never read the book before. Then, 3 years after that, I revisited the book again in my semester of student teaching, as, with the help of a real teacher, I made my first unit and taught my first class and got to choose my first book. This was in 2021, and this time, when I read Lord of the Flies, all I could think about was COVID. About a year after that, I was an official real high school English teacher who wasn't regretting everything yet and teaching my second version of a Lord of the Flies unit to an entirely new group of kids in an entirely different school. Every day, I read 60 new perspectives from 60 students who had never read the book before, and with those students came insights and analyses I had never even considered. It was like I was reading the book for the first time, right along with them. It is this ever-evolving timeliness and ability for unlimited reinterpretations that, of course, makes the book a staple for the classroom, but I think even an endless classroom setting is limiting Lord of the Flies. It is for this reason that while scrolling the greatest bulwark of civilization on the internet, Reddit, I thought of Lord of the Flies when I came across a post asking what a certain sub thought was the most important book. There wasn't even a conversation in my mind. The book just appeared there. And sure, what important actually means here is nebulous and up to interpretation. There's not a right answer. If you're talking about sheer influence or historical impact, the answer is clearly something like the Bible. If you're talking about contemporary cultural impact or name recognition, it's obviously something like The Hunger Games, Twilight, or Harry Potter. Point is, what important means to me and what important means to you are very different things. To me, important doesn't mean best, and it also doesn't mean favorite, neither of which are personal labels that I would apply to Lord of the Flies. I feel the need to focus on these distinctions for the same reason I wanted to make this video in general. You sit in a literary circle of people and you say something like, Paradise Lost is the most important work of British literature out there, and everyone nods thoughtfully. Or you posit that some other obscure work from the 1800s is the hill you intend to die on, and everyone will begin revealing their own beloved hidden gems to swing as literary swords in an effort to undercut your claim to literary breadth. But if you suggest that a novel from 1954 from an author largely absent any other notable work among any group besides his closest adherents, and this group of literary minds will hit you with a mixture of dismissive hand waves or simply the fluoride stare in response to your shallow mind and literary myopia. But don't you know it's not even accurate, they'll say. Don't you know that a group of boys actually got stranded on an island and did a great job getting along? But don't you know that the characters are all shallow archetypal allegories? But don't you know that the language is stiff and lacking in color or depth? Don't you know the book's dedication to allegory and metaphor make it rigid and boring read that fails when compared to other cerebral allegories of its era like East of Eden or even The Lord of the Rings? And then they'll follow with personal insults about how you aren't even a reader, you aren't educated, never read a classic before, and you're a dumbass. The fact that Lord of the Flies is a high school staple is one of the things working against it, honestly, as no matter how you approach a text in the high school setting, there is inevitably only so much time and a certain amount of boxing in you need to do in order for the text to work in a teenager's mind. They can't just start at the top. They have to start somewhere, though, and Lord of the Flies is as good a starting point for critical analysis as any. Hence why so many classrooms, and therefore readers, are helpless to look at the text as anything other than an allegorical vehicle for teaching high schoolers about symbolism. No, Lord of the Flies does not have the most complex characters in all of literature, and no, it doesn't have the most global impact on form or structure, and no, it's not even that old, one of the main criteria snobs will cling to when evaluating a work's merit. But even if it did have those things, none of those are things that matter to me when I think about the most important book that I have ever read. Because what Lord of the Flies does have are timeless lessons about society, in and out groups, groupthink, demagoguery, Fascism, science, reason, war, psychology, religion, patriarchy, teenagers, bullying, and the apocalypse that I see reflected in life every single day. Not because I'm stuck on an island with a choir or boys from a military academy, but because that island and that choir and that academy are reflections of the real world as Golding saw it in 1954, and the real world as I saw it in 2014, 2015, 2019, 2021, and every year since then. So with all of that said, let me tell you a little about that world and the place that I see in it for William Golding's Lord of the Flies. In an effort to not be too dismissive, I will take some time to discuss the novel's shortcomings, both literarily and educationally. It's not a perfect novel, and really no novel is, but I don't think that any of these flaws inherently detract from the story's value or importance, as again, it is the story and its lessons which I find so moving and timeless, not necessarily the prose or the structure. To begin with the shallow elements, the first chapter of this book is grueling, especially in a room full of teenagers on your 5th straight year of reading and second time reading it in a day. Golding's prose, while often dreamlike and rich in atmosphere, does tend to be turgid, replete with redundant descriptions of rocks or trees, which at a certain point fail to be amusing and forego their necessity for symbolism. To the degree which Golding linguistically fetishizes everything from vines to the physical machinations of Piggy fashioning a fulcrum to remove the conch from the water, or overwrought to the point of exhaustion, and make the book feel much longer than its paltry 200 pages. Golding loses the energy of the novel in verbose descriptions where a simple "they gathered wood" would have sufficed, particularly in the novel's first half. Superficial though this critique is, I do think there is an element of this which bleeds into what many would view as lackluster character development. For example, the reader is fed more information about Ralph's developing boxer-like build and somersaults while swimming than we are his feelings on almost anything. And while yes, a key part of the novel is its ambiguity, the characters here only have so many levels they can be parsed down to via inferences or context clues. Golding breaks that old 8th grade rule of show don't tell repeatedly, similar to his contemporary Tolkien, by telling us every crevice of his physical setting, but showing us very little of his characters' hearts or souls. It is this ambiguity of character which I imagine led Jack Thorne, writer of the most recent BBC adaptation, to flesh out his characters by providing them embellished traits which, well, maybe inferable, are essentially entirely new additions to the text. Though, again, the archetypal nature of the boys here is not an accident nor a shortcoming of Golding's writing ability. As reflections of various parts of society, the boys are meant to be shallow, in the sense that a reflective pool is shallow. We are meant to see ourselves in them, not as self-inserts in the classic fantasy sense, but in the sense that we may not always like what we see in our reflections, and thus try to hide from those reflections. And while I don't think the text requires you to like or enjoy this approach, I do think it is essential to understand that it is an intentional approach. But regardless of intentionality or not, the structure does not lend itself to rich characters prone to obvious layers. But nor, however, does the structure make the characters entirely uninteresting. Piggy, in particular, is among the most sympathetic characters in literature. Ralph does have a genuine character arc, and Simon's conversation with the Lord of the Flies is indicative of a psychological complexity which belies a certain degree of empathetic depth. But one must remember, as well, that these characters are children. They're not fully developed adults. One of the most notable efforts to address this shallowness, or at the very least, impotent lack of agency from the characters, is in the previously mentioned Jack Thorne adaptation for the BBC. Piggy, in particular, is subject to a dignity he's utterly lacking in Golding's text. Described in various terms as fat and ridiculous, subject to all manner of humiliation, Thorne's version preserves this humiliation, but elevates Piggy's agency to a degree which removes his archetypal passivity. This is most clear by at long last answering something a student asks me every year. What is Piggy's real name?
It's Nicholas. My Auntie Joan calls me Nicky.
And while Piggy's death comes in a sudden blow which removes him from the novel's pages in a sickeningly fast fashion, Thorne keeps his Nicholas around to the story's final moments, drawing out Piggy's death and giving Ralph time to bury this version of the character in a callback to the show's first episode, where Piggy advocated for the dignified Christian burial of the pilot, a scene absent from the book, but which adds much to the characters as three-dimensional beings. We are told Piggy is washed out to sea, but in Thorne's version, we see Ralph bury his friend through a screen of tears. No scene better highlights the rounding out of these archetypes in the BBC miniseries than that scene where the boys find the deceased pilot, and no scene better illustrates the novel's commitment to these characters as symbolic archetypes than the novel's counterpart to this scene. In the novel, three boys, Jack, Ralph, and Simon, climb to the top of the island to survey it, and along the way, find a large boulder which they promptly shove down the mountain. The purpose of the scene in the novel is both tactile and symbolic. Functionally, it serves to unite Jack, Ralph, and Simon and establish a bit of camaraderie and separate them further from Piggy. On the note of Piggy, it also immediately establishes a physical structure that foreshadows his later death in a similar manner. But symbolically, Golding gets heavy-handed in his metaphor for colonization as the boys claim dominion over the island and push over the rock simply as a means of exerting control over that island. The graphic novel adaptation by Amy DeJong ties the colonization imagery explicitly to a war culture by describing the fall of the rock as similar to a bomb going off. This is all in the same chapter where Golding begins to personify his island as a woman the boys take advantage of. Indeed, maybe personifies his island even more than he personifies his boys, but we'll come back to this later. To critics, the scene can be seen as rather rigid and creates a one-dimensional view of our heroes, which also stands in direct contrast to their later characterization. Exerting dominion over the island in such a way is out of line for the Christ-like Simon, and unlike Ralph or Jack, this is not an example of laying a foundation for character development. Once more, symbolism comes before character, and layers of personality are replaced by degrees of archetype. The weaknesses of the scene, as an example for Golding's ability, or perhaps lack of ability, to richly characterize, are made the more obvious by Thorne's treatment of it in his adaptation. Firstly, Thorne allows Nicholas, his Piggy, to join the other three boys on their quest. And while Piggy suffers his eternal ribbing at the hands of Jack, the scene also lends Jack and Piggy a chance to interact one-on-one, something they are not afforded in the text. It also allows Piggy to make Jack look like a fool, and Jack a chance to sing and dance like a normal choir kid. But beyond that, it allows Piggy to overcome his physical weakness in a way his novel counterpart never does. Rather than being stuck at home with the kids, so to speak, Piggy suffers through his asthma and makes the climb, giving this version of the character a layer of perseverance and discipline Golding's archetype does not. The real richness comes when the boys find Thorne's boulder, however. Or rather, when they do not. Instead of a boulder they push to exert dominion over the island, Thorne's group of 4 finds the deceased pilot of their plane still strapped to his chair. They feel obligated to remove the body, and Piggy and Simon advocate for burying the man in a Christian way. Jack argues against this and eventually wins, suggesting instead they simply push the man down the mountain and into the sea. The boys try and fail to lift the pilot with a seat and instead shove him per Jack's suggestion. The body then falls down the mountain, causing as much damage as the boulder in the novel or bomb in the graphic novel while the boys watch. Simon then eulogizes the pilot as the other boys listen. This scene gives Piggy a chance to do more than simply whine. It also removes obvious foreshadowing of his death, allowing him to be defined by more than just his mortality. It also establishes a closer link between the 4 Biggins and adds another layer to their burgeoning lack of morality, how to care for the dead. I think it's easy to read all of this as a rebuttal to the text's simplicity, and in a way maybe it is, but I personally rather feel that this scene and the others like it are loving additions to a template which Thorne feels is only a few brushstrokes away from completion. But another criticism owed the characters and therefore themes being reflections of a specific British archetype is also one of the contributing factors toward the novel's propensity for finding itself banned over the years, and that criticism is one of racism. The criticism stems from uses of words like savage throughout the text, and other lines from Piggy's comparison of Jack's tribe to a bunch of painted Indians, or in some earlier versions, a bunch of painted... And sure, Golding's exploration of these ideas is not the most delicate, especially by 2026 standards, but keep in mind this novel is a deconstructed satirization of classic adventure stories, several of which Golding's characters directly reference, such as Treasure Island. In these stories, a sailor or explorer, often British, washes up on an island only to find that its inhabitants and native people are bloodthirsty savages who want to eat or kill him. The British hero must then either defeat, colonize, and or civilize the savage before claiming the island for himself and or the British crown. Golding subverts the structure by leaving his island uninhabited. Rather than find or confront native savages, Golding's British boys become the savages, after claiming the island as their own, as previously mentioned. And well, yes, the turning of the boys to savages does still presuppose a line between savage others and a civilized British in the real world. I think it is important to look at what Golding is trying to say here. To me, Golding is making the case that the British are capable of great savagery, again via unflattering comparisons to native peoples, but in so doing, Golding is also making the case that colonization is itself savage. And further, don't forget that these boys are meant to serve as a microcosm of their society, and more specifically, patriarchy. Their behavior and sense of militarism are a result of a patriarchal system which creates boys who exist solely to become soldiers. It is this attitude, characterized by Jack's "we're English, and English are the best at everything" line, which leads to their destruction. After all, at the end of the novel, the boys destroy the entire island as a result of their militaristic colonization, something not even the most savage of all native populations has ever done. In The Savages in the Forest, Decolonizing William Golding by Stefan Holland, Holland explores the racist elements of the novel by comparing it to criticisms African author Chinua Achebe made of similar works exploring colonization, especially Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And while Stefan does make some interesting observations, Stefan does so without the grace or ability of Achebe, and as a result, perfectly encapsulates the reductive view of the text that I feel most critics of the text tend to take. Holland specifically references Jack's line about the English being the best at everything, and then writes, "The naivete does not fully cover the implied understanding of Africa. Jack is only conscious, like Golding, and to use Golding's own words, that he comes from one of those rare, fortunate places on the surface of the globe where, by desperate efforts, the bright side of man has been enabled to emerge, and at this point, he is intent on keeping this bright side in the ascendant. Jack's formulation of the threat is repeated at various points, and as the situation becomes more desperate, the chauvinist and racist implications become more overt. The veneer of colonist civilization is cracking, and the nice white children are turning into black savages. The blacks are taking over, coming into their element, and so the novel echoes fears of insurgent nationalism. To put it most simply, whiteness is converting to blackness." Here, I think Holland is missing the point a little bit. Golding is using Jack as a vehicle of everything wrong with British culture. Jack embodies chauvinistic nationalism and racism. Yes, that is precisely the point, and the reader is expected to walk away from Jack with feelings of disgust and rage. These feelings of British superiority are not meant to be held in high esteem, and for a novel which falls under fire for characters who are simple archetypes, it is stupefying to me that so-called literary critics are incapable of applying those character archetypes to the novel's themes. And on the note of racism and Golding's attempts to confront it, I think the final line of the novel has much to tell us. Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true, wise friend called Piggy. Again, this is a clear reference to Joseph Conrad's previously mentioned 1899 novella Heart of Darkness, which itself is a similar rebuttal to mainstream ideas concerning the colonization of Africa, though that text has its own critics and allegations of racism, such as Achebe, as well. But nonetheless, many of the big ideas translated from Heart of Darkness to its loose adaptation Apocalypse Now overlap with Lord of the Flies. The normalization of violence, inevitability of men to be monsters in a militarized echo chamber, the internal battle between good and evil, the collapse of civilization to savagery, and, of course, war crimes.
Horror. Horror.
Train young men to drop fire on people, but their commanders won't allow them to write "fuck" on their airplane because it's obscene.
Smells like victory. Someday this war's gonna end.
The point of me covering all this being that, yes, when you take the work at its most surface level reading and simply stop there, the work will of course seem surface level. Which brings me to the final, and to me most frustrating criticism, that the novel is not an accurate portrayal of what would actually happen if a group of boys or men were stranded on an island together. First and foremost, of course, it's probably not what would actually happen, nor is that the point of the book. It's not a what if you beg your parents to buy you at the book fair in 3rd grade and then never read. Golding uses a wide brush to paint jagged strokes, boxing in big ideas, but the commentary of those ideas exist outside of Golding's strokes. This is also a goofy criticism to me because we don't hold any other book to this standard. Oh, well, Les Mis is a bad book because no rich man would actually befriend the poor like this. Yeah, so Paradise Lost is lame because it's just an allegory, and we know from actual fallen angels that they would do things differently. Honestly, The Hunger Games has no lessons about dystopian societies because no government has ever televised games where 24 kids fight to the death. It's not as if Lord of the Flies is meant to be scientific. It has elements which are about science, yes, and elements which are sociological, yes, but you're not supposed to be reading this book with a clipboard and calculator in hand. To reduce Golding's pessimistic portrayal of society in a microcosm to something which fails literarily because it doesn't reflect the results of a double-blind social experiment are absurd. Maybe I'm about to ruffle some feathers here, but this is just the same guy. This is like the guy who always loves to point out that, well, the Stanford prison experiment is actually inaccurate. Yes, we know, but you're missing the point. You aren't listening yet. But also, let's just say that the scientific or hypothetical accuracy of the scenario in the novel does matter literarily. After all, Golding is trying to warn us of various apocalyptic elements which exist in the scientific human condition, and his warning should therefore be based on real scientific observations. Supposing we believe all this, I would posit that the book is accurate in its portrayal of how young boys would behave. My dumbest and most anecdotal piece of evidence is that I'm a teacher in a public school. I observe teenage boys and how they behave every day. The things they say, the things they do, the way they treat each other, the way they treat girls, and most importantly, how they behave when they don't think I'm watching. In every group of boys, there is Jack, there is a Ralph, there is a Piggy, there's a Roger, there's a Simon, there's a Sam, and there's an Eric. My second piece of anecdotal evidence is this. I was once a little boy. I have been a brother, a father, I'm going to be a grandfather. I have never been a sister or a mother or grandfather. Just kidding, that is actually a quote from Golding himself discussing why he wrote the book about boys rather than girls. I'll explore the rest of this quote later, but my point here is that Golding, like myself, understands that this is a novel about the male experience. And as a man who was once a boy, I implore anyone who doesn't see any accuracy in this novel to visit a middle or a high school locker room on 5-Star Friday or just any random unsupervised moment and see how long it takes for you to have a towel wrapped around your head or a container of Axe body spray to come flying over the lockers with a rubber band around the top like a fucking container of mustard gas in World War I. But jokes aside, is there a real scientific justification to Golding's portrayal of civilization, or lack of? Well, I would point to the Stanford prison experiment, but we've already established that that's probably not the most credible. We could, however, point to the famous UK experiment, which put 10 boys in a house and 10 girls in a different house. This experiment, though really reality TV showcase is more apt description, supports Golding's hypothesis, as the boys quickly destroyed their house while the girls cooked and cleaned and worked as a team. Whether or not this holds up to any kind of scientific scrutiny will, of course, be up for debate. So maybe instead we take a look at Stanley Milgram's shock experiment to highlight how willing people are to hurt others when following orders. But in the same vein, we can also point to Marina Abramovic's piece of performance art, Rhythm Zero, from 1974. But that work is too rich to reduce to just a rebuttal here. Instead, we'll talk about Marina Abramovic in later sections of this. I would, in more seriousness, point to one of my favorite and somewhat overlooked sociological episodes of the 1960s, The Third Wave, conducted by high school social studies teacher Ron Jones. Though not exactly a scientific study either, The Wave, like Lord of the Flies, doesn't need to be. Ron Jones stumbled on something which led him to a conclusion, rather than structuring something to support a conclusion, like Philip Zimbardo in the Stanford prison experiment. If you aren't familiar, which you likely aren't, Ron Jones was teaching his high school history class about the Holocaust and Nazi Germany. As Jones himself wrote of the incident years after, "We were studying Nazi Germany, and in the middle of a lecture I was interrupted by the question, how could the German populace claim ignorance of the slaughter of the Jewish people? How could the townspeople, railroad conductors, teachers, doctors, claim they knew nothing about concentration camps and human carnage? How can people who were neighbors and maybe even friends of the Jewish citizen say they weren't there when it happened?" It was a good question. I didn't know the answer. And as such as there were several months still to go in the school year and I was already at World War II, I decided to take a week and explore the question. Jones then broke his class into a rigid hierarchy piece by piece over the next few days. He created a class motto, strict rules, appointed secret police, encouraged students to rat on each other, gave them armbands, and ostracized anyone who didn't fall in line with his new club, the Third Wave. Long story short, things eventually got out of hand, and fights were breaking out around the school. The exercise was getting dangerous, and Jones ended it all early. In the ABC dramatized version of events starring Steven Weber, the Ron Jones character promises all the students that they are just one chapter in a nationwide political movement rising in opposition to the Vietnam War, and ushers them all into the high school auditorium to see a speech from the new presidential candidate at the head of their movement. Instead of this candidate appearing, the character based on Jones plays a speech by Hitler and tells the students they would have made wonderful Nazis. This event happened in real life too, though with less drama. Rather than playing a speech of Hitler, Jones simply let the TV play static for 7 minutes before he revealed to the group that there is no leader. And as Jones writes, "There is no leader. There is no such thing as a national youth movement called the Third Wave. You have been used, manipulated, shoved by your own desires into the place you now found yourself. You are no better or worse than the German Nazis we have been studying. You thought that you were the elect, that you were better than those outside this room. You bargained your freedom for the comfort of discipline and superiority. You chose to accept that group's will and the big lie over your own conviction. Oh, you think to yourself that you were just going along for the fun, that you could extricate yourself at any moment. But where were you heading? How far would you have gone? Let me show you your future." With that, I switched on a rear screen projector. It quickly illuminated a white drop cloth hanging behind the television. Large numbers appeared in a countdown. The roar of the Nuremberg rally blasted into vision. My heart was pounding. In ghostly images, the history of the Third Reich paraded into the room. The discipline, the march of super race, the big lie, arrogance, violence, terror, people being pushed into vans, the visual stench of death camps, faces without eyes, the trials, the plea of ignorance. I was only doing my job. My job. As abruptly as it started, the film froze to a halt on a single written frame. Everyone must accept the blame. No one can claim that they didn't, in some way, take part. Though not scientific, Ron Jones' experience is certainly not allegorical. It was real. It happened, and it happened mostly on accident. Jones stumbled on a truth, an answer to a question he could not articulate, and these truths, these answers, are the same ones that Golding is exploring in his text. I make my students study The Wave after we finish Lord of the Flies. We watch the goofy ABC movie, but also the more introspective and interesting documentary made by former students of Jones, Lesson Plan. I highly recommend Lesson Plan if this topic interests you. Lesson Plan is so fascinating to me partly because the students, at the time it was made, now in their 60s, don't all have the same memory or recollection of events. They disagree on details, but they all remember that something happened. They all remember Jones's main lesson and how easily they fell apart. The first year I taught The Wave, I actually reached out to the guy who ran the website dedicated to aggregating all existing resources on the topic, and I was shocked when he replied to me. Turned out that the website was run by a man named Mark Hancock, a student who went through The Wave and also worked on Lesson Plan. Mark was an incredibly nice guy who spent several hours on the phone and many emails with me answering my questions about the whole thing, and he even spoke to my class virtually. And not only that, but he brought Ron Jones himself with, and they both took questions from my students. Unfortunately, Mark passed away the year after this, and Jones is not really doing events anymore, so that was the first and only year I was able to connect with them, or connect my students to them. And I bring this up because Mark was a truly kind man who valued education in a way few people do. He was a pure academic, and I wish I could have spent more hours talking with him. His work is being carried on by his partner, and I really do suggest checking out Lesson Plan or thewavehome.com to learn more about this. I haven't done it justice here, and I do not want to reduce Mark and his partner's incredible work to simply a footnote about a novel. As for that novel, how does The Wave connect to, let alone vindicate, Golding's simulation in Lord of the Flies in ways other studies or experiments don't? Well, I think the simplest answer to this is in the Third Wave's inception. Like Golding's novel, it is a direct response to World War II and the horrors of the Nazi regime. I think most people, both critics and fans of Lord of the Flies, forget that Golding wrote this whole thing based partly on his experience as a Royal Navy lieutenant during the war from 1940 to 1945. And I don't mean that he was just on a ship or might have been deployed. Golding was 29 years old when his enlistment began, and this motherfucker commanded a rocket ship on D-Day. I bring this up to highlight that Golding did not just passively live through World War II. He was actively engaged in the worst chapter of modern human history. Nikola Tesla is often quoted as saying, "You may live to see man-made horrors beyond your comprehension." And like everyone else of his era, Golding did just that, realizing through both his war experience and this book that the beast is only us. Forget the shared concepts of group responsibility and the students abdicating their own roles in something horrible the same way the boys abdicate their roles in the death of Simon or the death of Piggy or anything else. Both The Wave and Lord of the Flies are products of and responses to World War II. I'm not going to say that they're simple explanations of the war and the Holocaust. They're not, much as their creators may want them to be. But I do think they are both complex explorations of one piece of the war and the Holocaust, and that reducing Lord of the Flies to a story about what stranded boys or sailors would or would not actually do on an island is one of the greatest literary crimes a person can commit. And while yes, the novel does function beyond the culture of World War II it was written in, it is certainly not exclusive to that, and there are countless other experiments, works, etc. that you can use to vindicate some of Golding's most shallow conclusions. Mainly that, when left without consequence for their actions, regular people, especially in Golding's case men, will have no trouble turning to, justifying, or enjoying violence. It is the casual propensity of this violence in every aspect of modern patriarchal society that I see the vindications for in Golding's work, and the reason I maintain that, despite its flaws in science or form, Lord of the Flies is the most important book that I have read.
Sharpen a stick at both ends.
A few years ago, actually it was almost 10 years ago at this point, there was an announcement that Scott McGee and David Siegel were producing an all-girls adaptation of Lord of the Flies for Warner Brothers. Everyone reacted really negatively, and almost a decade later, we still don't have this reimagining. I can only imagine it's been put on the permanent back burner due to the intense reaction just the announcement inspired, similar to how I imagine Zack Snyder descended against pursuing his adaptation of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. Personally, I'm in favor of everything being made, even if it's bad, but that's just me. I bring this up because I think it reveals an important part of Golding's story and many readers' experience with it. People criticized these two guys for missing the point of the book by making assertions that girls would have performed much better on the island than boys, and that Golding wrote about boys because boys are bad and girls are not. I think that this is partly true, and that this is partly not so true. First, as I mentioned in the last part, Golding did choose to write about boys on purpose, explicitly for specific reasons. If you recall,
I was once a little boy. I have been a brother. I have been a father. I am going to be a grandfather. I have never been a sister or a mother or a grandmother. So this is why I wrote it really about little boys. That's one answer. Another answer is, of course, to say that if you, as it were, scale down human beings, scale down society, if you land with a group of little boys, they are more like scaled-down society than a group of little girls would be. Don't ask me why, and this is a terrible thing to say because I'm going to be chased from hell to breakfast by all the women who talk about equality. This is nothing to do with equality at all. I mean, I think women are foolish to pretend they're equal to men. They're far superior and always have been. But one thing you cannot do with them is take a bunch of them and boil them down, so to speak, into a set of little girls who would then become a kind of image of civilization, of society. That's another reason why they were little boys.
this seems decisive in and of itself, but I think there are a lot of different interpretations about Golding himself that can be made in response to this, and to get the right interpretations, I think it's important to remember that Golding was a misandrist. I mean that both in the sense that he disliked men, males specifically, but also disliked men as in mankind, and whatever meaning or demographic you want to assign to that. But in this quote specifically, he's referring to mankind as men, male-dominated and created, with the natural consequence of that domination being war.
What are you guys doing?
To Golding, women do not wage war. They do not destroy cities, they do not drop bombs, they do not rape and kill. Men do those things because men raise boys to do those things through militarization. Women, then, are the opposite. Similar to the suggestion that the British becoming savage will necessitate a savage state, and that the savage state must be embodied by someone, as our friend Holland would say, native black or brown people, so too does Golding's binary view of men and women inadvertently still reduce women to a monolith reflecting values of purity and nothing else. I don't think Golding is trying to white knight here, and I also don't think that he would backpedal. I think that he is projecting his own inner hatred onto a positive vessel of opposition to that hatred. That positive vessel being women. In a piece titled, Actually, an all-girls Lord of the Flies could be a good idea for the website Electric Lit, author Elena Schubach makes the case that an all-girls version of the story would add a layer of complexity to Golding, and therefore his novel's view of women as more than just a pure monolith. This is a really excellent article that goes beyond just the quippy merits of this movie that will never happen, so I recommend just reading the entire thing if you have time, but in the interest of time for us here together, I only want to focus on a few key pieces that I think highlight Golding himself and what inadvertently comes through about women in his novel. So, Schubach begins by summarizing, in Why I'm Not a Feminist, Jessica Crispin writes that the idea of this set of supposedly innately female attributes in fact originates with men, but that women have adopted this belief because it suits us to believe this about ourselves. It makes us special. Crispin goes on to surmise that many women identify with these allegedly feminine characteristics, compassion, emotional intelligence, receptivity, and not masculine ones, foolishness, predation, brutality, in order to locate a sense of collective value in their womanhood after centuries of oppression, to bolster their community's power by insisting they stand on a solid moral high ground. There's a sinister side to this, a building of political clout by identifying a noble us and a savage them, though I don't think that's the intention of most feminists who advance the notion that women, by dint of being women, are somehow morally superior. Any woman, after all, who has been to junior high knows very well that girls are more than capable of viciousness. Anyone who's followed even vaguely the careers of female leaders like Margaret Thatcher knows how absurd it is to say that if women were in charge, the world would cease to be riven by conflict. Maybe it's more about the human tendency to turn one's face away from the darkness within, from the shadow described by Carl Jung, the one we construct over our lifetimes out of all the components of ourselves that condemn us, that reveal we are less good than we prefer to believe. The point here that I want to highlight is the assertion that female characteristics, even positive ones, are still a result of patriarchy. I think that this is a very large and interesting topic that could easily consume this entire video, so instead I want to keep the focus on Golding himself and the reason I think he's given us something important to consider. Namely, many people, so far myself included, neglect what Golding is trying to say about where evil and human nature come from. Are they the result of society and patriarchy, or are society and patriarchy a result of human nature? To be honest, I think that this is where Golding's book is the most complicated, complex, and interesting, but for critics would probably be the least developed and least interesting. For all the time we spent early reviewing the ways the novel is simplistic, this is one of the ways which it is not. The characters, archetypes they may be, are not solely static. They change. Some evolve, while others devolve. Ralph begins the novel as somewhat callous and often disregards Piggy, though by the end he has come to view Piggy as his one true wise friend. Jack, well quick to anger even in his first scene, still begins the novel eager to help Ralph and provide a value to the island. There's a scene early on when Jack and Ralph are only able to carry a log because they do it together. Even the most heinous boy, Roger, is unable to actually hit the little ones with rocks at the beginning of the book for fear of getting in trouble. Compare this to the end when he intentionally kills Piggy with a boulder. Roger is particularly important when we look at that scene of him throwing rocks at the little ones. In the same section, Roger knocks over the little ones' sandcastles and kicks sand into their eyes. Then at the end of the chapter, one of the older little ones is doing the same to the children smaller than him. To me, this is one of the most important parts of the book because Golding is showing us how the boys learn their bad behavior. The little ones aren't mean to each other by default. In fact, they're playing and getting along well. It's the older boys, the Rogers, who teach them the bad behavior. And where do they learn the bad behavior? From their fathers. There are two conclusions to be drawn from this. One, that Golding is saying bad behavior is not innate, even in men. But secondly, bad behavior still comes from men specifically, as the boys reflect that male and specifically militarily dominated society that they live in. It is the military and the military structures the boys grow up in which encourages this violence. But would this not also suggest then that women and men both begin as inherently good? Well, not exactly. Golding's closest look into this nature versus nurture argument for both women and men comes, of course, in Simon's conversation with the Lord of the Flies himself. Representing evil, sin, the devil, demon, whatever label you want to use or apply, the Lord of the Flies can also stand for young shadow self, Freud's id, the unconscious, the lowest form of Kohlberg's moral development, on and on and on forever. But at his most basic level, the Lord of the Flies is exactly what the boys are afraid of. The beast. He's a monster. And as Simon wisely knows before he ever meets the beast is inside of us. Fancy thinking the beast was something you could hunt and kill, said the head. For a moment or two, the forest and all the other dimly appreciated places echoed with the parody of laughter. You knew, didn't you? I'm part of you. I'm the reason why it's no-go, why things are what they are. This is ridiculous. You know perfectly well you only meet me down there, so don't try to escape. Simon's body was arched and stiff. The Lord of the Flies spoke in the voice of a schoolmaster. Once more, much can be made of the scene, but in this context, I feel it is Golding's way of saying that there is an innate evil, a self-destructive something inside of all of us. The half-shut eyes were dim with the infinite cynicism of adult life. They assured Simon that everything was a bad business. But we don't have to let this evil, this beast, win. Jack doesn't have to kill the pig. He chooses to. The boys don't have to fall apart. They choose to. Ralph doesn't have to learn to respect Piggy. He chooses to. And when looked at this way, I think the same can be applied to women. They don't have to be good, but they choose to. And this is, to Golding, why they are so worthy of admiration. Although, I would like to point out two quick details about the Beast. In Jack Thorne's BBC adaptation, it sounds to me like the Beast is voiced by a woman, or at least somebody who is not male, though the role's uncredited, so I can't be sure. If somebody knows the answer to that, feel free to let me know. But in the novel, Golding describes the Beast as speaking in the voice of a schoolmaster, once again creating a pipeline from evil to patriarchal institutions. I'm not entirely sure what Thorne is trying to say if he is casting the Beast as female. Perhaps that the boys have corrupted femininity through the desecration of the sow, or perhaps nothing at all. And Golding just had a lot of frustrations about education and private schools in particular, and I think he's just comparing those to prep for military academies and therefore war in general. Once more, is this scientific? Not exactly. Is any of it a universal truth? Not exactly. Is it still important? I believe that yes, it is. And the fact that we've had this conversation in so many different ways and through so many different pieces of media is one of the reasons why it remains important. To revisit our friend Elena Schubach at Electric Lit, but we do want narratives that present women in all their complexity, even if that mirror is a shadowed one. Or at least we say we do. So why is it impossible that a gender-swapped Lord of the Flies could offer this? But even if we take as written in stone his second answer, that he chose boys because he wanted to present a scaled-down society, and society being patriarchal, its microcosm must to be male, this doesn't seem to me a persuasive reason not to gender swap an adaptation of his book. Of course, there could not be a female mirror image of Lord of the Flies. You can't have a microcosm where there is no macrocosm, no matriarchal culture to pillory. But you could have something else. Say, an exploration of the way that girls, once removed from the world of men, might continue to uphold its rules, having never encountered any alternative to draw upon for their own desert island culture. One Twitter user joked that there already is a female Lord of the Flies called Mean Girls, and there's something to that. I've always found the strongest moment of that movie to be when Tina Fey's teacher, Miss Norbury, tells her female students that they all have got to stop calling each other sluts and whores. It just makes it okay for guys to call you sluts and whores. A sly reference to the infinite regress of men establishing a social order and women, absent any other model for living, maintain it, thus reinforcing men's continuation of it. All of this is to say that yes, we do have versions of Lord of the Flies that are about women in the same situations. The most obvious literary correlate is Kim Leggett's 2019 novel The Gracier, which puts teenage girls in essentially the same setting as Golding's boys, but for different reasons. In The Gracier, the setting is a patriarchal village, where teenage girls are forced to spend a year living in the woods to expel an evil magic which consumes them. Some obvious commentary on not just the Salem witch trials, but how women, especially women with any kind of power or difference, are viewed by society. I'd be interested in hearing Elena's thoughts on this, since it really takes these questions to the extreme and concludes that, yes, all these expectations of women and how they should behave are direct consequences of patriarchy. And while the girls in the woods do go sicko mode, a la Lord of the Flies, it is due to expectations put on them by their patriarchal village, and, in the end, they get their shit together and leave things better for the next group of girls, something Golding's boys don't even come close to doing. Kim Lidgett, however, seems to be much less of a misanthrope than Golding, both in the small man sense and larger mankind sense, which brings me to another reason Golding is such a misanthrope in both senses. In an unpublished memoir that he wrote for his wife called Men and Women Now, Golding tells a story of how he attempted to rape a 15-year-old girl when he was 18. To be clear, we don't have access to this memoir, or if we do, I couldn't find it, and everything that we know about it seems to be from biographers of Golding who are able to access it through his estate. In particular, much of this comes from the John Kerry biography, William Golding, the man who wrote Lord of the Flies. I won't go into the details of the whole event, but you can read more about it in Kerry's biography or this article by The Guardian if you want to know more. But the reason I mention this not very nice episode is to be honest and acknowledge that Golding was not a perfect man, and much of his dislike of other men, especially when it comes to views and treatments of women, may very likely be projections of his own feelings. Those feelings being guilt, if we're being generous to Golding, those feelings being depravity, if we are not being generous to Golding. However, I think it's still impossible to look at Golding's work and its commentary, or maybe lack of commentary, about patriarchy and gender relationships without keeping this episode in mind. In particular, a key part of Lord of the Flies is what Dr. Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park would call,
I call the rape of the natural world.
Especially through the patriarchal art of war. Sexual assault imagery is pervasive throughout the entire book, being used especially prominently when the boys are doing anything bad or being particularly destructive. From the very beginning, their arrival on the island hurts the island. Keep in mind that the crash landing creates a scar across the island, destroying trees and tearing up the earth. The imagery here is neither subtle nor difficult. Golding could have chosen any word, but he chose scar, immediately personifying the island, or, more explicitly, personifying the island as female, as Mother Earth. And don't forget that the boys are on the island as a result of war. Their plane was evacuating them and is itself a part of that military-industrial complex, allowing Golding to set up a clear distinction between the world of war and Mother Earth, the world of men, and the world of women. From there, Golding associates everything positive with femininity and everything negative with masculinity. Piggy, Golding's favorite character and the voice of reason, intelligence, and civilization, is raised by his aunt, the only one of the boys cared for by a maternal influence. Piggy himself is regularly ostracized by the other boys because he does not have their same masculine qualities. He's effeminate, prone to worry, and yet the only one who provides anything of value and the only tie to what the boys think of as the adult world. Though for Piggy, the word adult means feminine, and for the boys, adult means their fathers and the military school structure that they're used to. This link to the feminine world of culture and intelligence is symbolized by the conch, just as is personified by Piggy and the island. Take a look at Golding's descriptions of the conch when Ralph and Piggy first find it. In color, the shell was deep cream, touched here and there with fading pink. Between the point, worn away into a little hole, and the pink lips of the mouth, lay 18 inches of shell with a slight spiral twist, and covered with a delicate, embossed pattern. Now, maybe I've just played too much Marvel Rivals or I'm too much of a gooner, but this certainly sounds like Yonic imagery to me. I don't think it's coincidence that Roger destroys the conch when he kills Piggy, representing not just the death of Piggy's rational mind, but the death of any maternal, and therefore civilized, influence on the island. Hi everybody, this is my cat Arthur. He just decided to join us, so this is one of my two kitties. This all extends to the pigs, too. Take this passage, when Jack and the boys get their most violent kill. They surrounded the covert, but the sow got away with the sting of another spear in her flank. The trailing butts hindered her, and the sharp, cross-cut points were a torment. She blundered into a tree, forcing a spear still deeper, and after that, any of the hunters could follow her easily by the drops of vivid blood. The afternoon wore on, hazy and dreadful with damp heat. The sow staggered her way ahead of them, bleeding and mad, and the hunters followed, wedded to her in lust, excited by the long chase and the dropped blood. They could see her now, nearly got up with her, but she spurted with her last strength and held ahead of them again. They were just behind her when she staggered into an open space where bright flowers grew and butterflies danced around each other, and the air was hot and still. Here, struck down by the heat, the sow fell and the hunters hurled themselves at her. This dreadful eruption from an unknown world made her frantic. She squealed and bucked, and the air was full of sweat and noise and blood and terror. Roger ran around the heap, prodding with his spear whenever pig flesh appeared. Jack was on top of the sow, stabbing downward with his knife. Roger found a lodgment for his points and began to push, till he was leaning with his whole weight. The spear moved forward, inch by inch, and the terrified squealing became a high-pitched scream. Then Jack found the throat, and the hot blood spouted over his hands. The sow collapsed under them, and they were heavy and fulfilled upon her. The butterfly still danced, preoccupied, in the center of the clearing.
Oh, what's so great about discovery? It's a violent, penetrative act that scars what it explores, what you call discovery. I call the rape of the natural world.
Beyond simply the horror of the situation at its most basic level, it is impossible to interpret the scene as anything other than a metaphor for rape. I don't think I need to go into details, but phrases like wedded to her in lust and they were fulfilled upon her clearly characterize this for exactly what it is. An act of purely masculine aggression being carried out on a symbol not just for Mother Earth, but motherhood and femininity in general.
Does that mean now she's dead? Does that mean her children will die too?
Furthermore, the language here is similar to that used when the boys pushed the boulder down the mountain earlier, and when paired with that, we see Golding making a clear link between colonization and a form of social, cultural, and environmental rape as well. I think that much of this is informed by Golding's guilt and disgust over his role in the war, where he lamented the destruction it caused and the destruction he himself caused by firing rockets into the French countryside during the D-Day invasion. However, there is another layer to this that I find worth mentioning, and it builds on Golding's idea of femininity as a form of civilization. In his biography of Golding, John Carey devotes an entire chapter to Golding's years as a schoolteacher, where he taught exclusively boys. There are many obvious corollaries in Golding's experience of and feelings about teaching, which I'll cover a little bit more later, but a section at the end of this chapter really stood out to me. Beyond simply classroom instruction, Golding was also involved in his school's drama department, where all of the roles, male and female, were played by boys. Carey summarizes and paraphrases Golding's writings on the subject by saying, he remembers producing Murder in the Cathedral at British Wordsworth in 1959. As in all the school plays, the female parts were taken by boys, and he chose 4 boys to be the women of Canterbury. He taught them the basic movements of a woman's body, dressed them up, played the piano for them to dance, and told them, I want you to enjoy being girls. The result, he says, was the breaking up of all the dams and barriers. The boys were so happy, as if they were realizing an ambition they had had for years, as indeed he believed they were. It was as if they could not believe their luck. For what an adolescent boy has to bury deep out of sight and think of as a private shame was here given adult sanction and a social aim. It was treated as what it is, that is, something natural. Every little girl wants to be the fairy on the Christmas tree, and tell it not in Gath, but so does every little boy. In our society, children are sexed as a vet sexes kittens by examining their rudimentary sexual organs, but other realities are ignored. He goes on to regret, and men, women, and now, that he never realized, as a child, how common these feelings were in boys, so was left believing them peculiar to himself. Interesting. If we're just focusing on how this connects to the book, I think this reinforces the idea that Golding is seeing the natural state of mankind, male and female, as something more civilized, feminine, and calm, and that it is only later as boys get older that they are socialized into being violent and tools for the military. Again, talking specifically about privatized school boys, but you can apply it in general as well. But even more interesting are several assertions from figures in Golding's life who carry either interviews or quotes that say Golding was, himself, a repressed homosexual. And while the nature of Golding's sexual identity from these two facts is obviously more complicated than gay versus, well, not gay, I think it is irrefutable that Golding was working through something, and the misanthropic nature of Lord of the Flies explicitly illustrates that. This is a man uncomfortable with his own gender and sexuality, Much of this manifests itself in Thorne's BBC adaptation as well, where a romantic relationship between Jack and Simon is hinted at.
The other thing is, why aren't they little boys and little girls? Well, if they'd been little boys and little girls, we being who we are, sex would have raised its lovely head. And I didn't want this book to be about sex. I mean, sex is too trivial a thing to get in with a story like this, which was about the problem of evil and the problem of how people are to live together in society, not just as lovers or man and wife.
Despite Golding's assertions to the contrary, sex is present in the novel, if only a very negative form of repressed masculine sexuality. And yet, because of, despite of whatever, that repression, Golding is saying a lot about his views of male sexuality, that it is inherently violent, tied to war, and lacking anything even close to civility.
Everyone's going to be so pleased with you.
Again, is this a projection on Golding's part stemming from his experience with that girl when he was a teenager? I think that is very likely, as most men probably would not view their own sexuality in the same way. But I think that what Golding is really trying to explore here, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally, is something we understand with significantly more aplomb in 2026, and that is the idea of rape culture. By linking masculine sexuality to not just innate urges, but a social system which allows and even encourages sexual violence and a disregard for feminine autonomy in all things, but especially sex, Golding is making a pretty woke argument. While we look at rape culture as a manifestation of many things now, Golding emphasizes it as a product of militarization. It is impossible to ignore the phallic nature of missiles or the presumably phallic shape of the boys' plane as it ravages the serenity of the island. I do not think Golding would be at all miffed by the pop culture feminism which has produced such simple anecdotes as the man or bear dilemma, and he would say without hesitation, bear. Another piece of modern feminist art I'm confident Golding would love, and which summarizes many of his views on mankind very succinctly and almost artfully, is Marina's hit banger, Savages, which unfortunately I can't play because I'll get copyright struck. I'll get Thanos snapped. So I'm just gonna read the lyrics to you and just pretend that it's a poem. Murder lives forever, and so does war. It's survival of the fittest, rich against the poor. At the end of the day, it's a human trait, hidden deep down inside of our DNA. One man can build a bomb, another run a race, to save somebody's life and have it blow up in his face. I'm not the only one who finds it hard to understand. I'm not afraid of God. I am afraid of man. Is it running in our blood? Is it running in our veins? Is it running in our genes? Is it in our DNA? Humans aren't going to behave as we think we always should. Yeah, we can be bad as we can be good. Underneath it all, we're just savages, hidden behind shirts, ties, and marriages. Another day, another tale of rape, another ticking bomb to bury deep and detonate. I'm not the only one who finds it hard to understand. I'm not afraid of God. I am afraid of man. I mean, do I even need to explain anything? Savages, like Lord of the Flies, weaves together questions about mankind's innate need for violence with a recognition that mankind can be better, can be more than savages. This returns to Golding's thesis that while, yes, there is evil inside of us, we can also do more. Marina is just as, if not more, pointed than Golding in her critique as well, with the refrain, I'm not afraid of God, I am afraid of man. And this isn't the only time Marina overlaps with Golding either. See her other masterpiece, Man's World. Mother Nature's dying, nobody's keeping score. I don't want to live in a man's world anymore. If you have a mother, daughter, or friend, maybe it's time you comprehend. The world that you live in ain't the same one as them, so don't punish me for not being a man. Here again, Marina, like Golding, explicitly points out the feminine nature of Mother Nature and blames men, patriarchy, for destroying her. I think Marina is more concerned with late-stage capitalism than the military-industrial complex as Golding was, but hey, good news! They're the same thing, or at the very least, they are inextricably linked. Both artists are hyper-fixated on the predatory nature of patriarchal systems focused on domination. Domination of other countries, of other peoples, of land, of economies, of women, and they're not the only artists or critics exploring this either, of course. Karl Marx did it too, and both Golding and Marina are probably being influenced him, just as many other people have been influenced and covered the same topics. Earlier I mentioned an artist named Marina Abramovic, and no, this is not the same Marina as Marina from Marina and the Diamonds, whose song we just studied. Marina Abramovic is a Serbian performance artist known for a series she did back in the 70s, which culminated in an exhibit called Rhythm Zero. In Rhythm Zero, Abramovic willingly put herself at the mercy of an audience for 6 hours and allowed them to choose from a table of 69 objects. Some made for nice things, others made for not so nice things. The goal was to see what people would do to someone, in this case, a woman, if the fear of punishment or consequence were removed. I'm sure you'll be shocked to hear this, but the audience was not very kind to Marina Abramovic. Just like Golding's boys, they started off alright, but just like Roger realizing no adults were going to stop him from throwing rocks, as Abramovic's audience fully registered there'd be no consequence for how they treated her worse and worse. As Katie Hessel writes for The Guardian, the performances draw on Abramovic's stripped upbringing in post-war Yugoslavia, raised by parents who were high-ranking officials in the socialist government. I grew up with incredible control, discipline, and violence at home. Everything was extreme, she has said. The rhythms explore the tightening of rules in an authoritarian society, but also what it is like to be a woman in a deeply misogynist culture. Katie Hessel describes what happened further. At first, her audience was passive, but as time went on, they turned violent, with people using the objects to cut into her skin, rip her clothes, stick a knife between her legs, and attach a piece of paper to her body that read, "File." Surrounding the table at the RA, there are photographs of the performance. They show, predominantly, men playing with the objects, touching Abramovic's body, ogling and laughing at her with their friends, as she stands there alone, tears filling her eyes. Thomas McEvely, an art critic present for the event, described, "It began tamely. Someone turned her around. Someone thrust her arms into the air. Someone touched her somewhat intimately. The Neapolitan night began to heat up. In the third hour, all her clothes were cut from her with razor-sharp blades. In the fourth hour, the same blades began to explore her skin. Her throat was slashed so someone could suck her blood. Various minor sexual assaults were carried out on her body. She was so committed to the piece that she would not have resisted rape or murder. Faced with her abdication of will, with its implied collapse of human psychology, a protective group began to define itself in the audience. When a loaded gun was thrust to Marina's head and her own finger was being worked around the trigger, a fight broke out between the audience factions. And finally, Abramovic herself, what I learned was that if you leave it up to the audience, they can kill you. I felt really violated. They cut up my clothes, stuck rose thorns in my stomach, one person aimed the gun at my head, and another took it away. It created an aggressive atmosphere. After exactly 6 hours, as planned, I stood up and started walking toward the audience. Everyone ran away to escape an actual confrontation. Like Ron Jones, Marina Abramovic stumbled upon something not just revealing about human nature, but patriarchy, especially patriarchy as it relates to war and conflict. Note that Katie Hessel explicitly stated Abramovic's art rose from her experience in authoritarian Yugoslavia, just as Golding's work rose from his experience at war with authoritarian Germany, and Jones' work rose from his exploration of the Holocaust. All three of these people are exploring very different conditions of the human mind, and yet settle on the same intersectional problems: authoritarian militarization as an extension of patriarchy. Makes you think. And it makes me think that the presence of these concepts is integral to Lord of the Flies as a text. I think a feminist reading or feminist retelling of the novel is insane, because there is no other reading of the text. The feminist lens is the lens that Golding wants you to use, and while I think Golding's story can be reimagined, as Kim Leggett does in The Gracier, it cannot be divorced from those feminist themes. This may be why our closest thing to an all-girls adaptation of Lord of the Flies, the TV series Yellow Jackets, doesn't have the same thematic bite as either Golding's work or Leggett's, because it's much less interested in politics. And I know what you're thinking. This again? Didn't you already make a video about this? And yeah, I did, and it was the response to that video which has made me want to address Lord of the Flies more comprehensively here, as many of the criticisms I laid out in part 1 of this can be found in the comments of that video. Firstly, let me address something many nice people pointed out to me in that video. Yellow Jackets is not an adaptation of Lord of the Flies. Never mind the fact that I explicitly stated that in my video and never claimed that it was an adaptation, but what I did say, and what is irrefutably true if you do even a small amount of research, is that the writers and showrunners of Yellow Jackets were explicitly inspired by Lord of the Flies. More to the point, however, writer Ashley Lyle was inspired to create Yellow Jackets by the outrage about the previously mentioned all-female adaptation of the novel. "You were never a teenage girl, sir," she wrote in response to someone who jested the worst a group of girls on the island could do was collaborate to death. Lord of the Flies is about how socialization falls away and how society is a facade. We thought, who's more socialized than women? As girls, you learn early on how to make people like you and what the social hierarchies are. It's a more interesting way of having things fall away. The mask is even thicker. It's a more layered amount of preconceived notions of how to behave and act. This is from Lyle in an interview she did with The Hollywood Reporter, and I think these are all valid observations and critiques that can make for really interesting drama and commentary. In fact, I know they can, because they do in Legend to the Gracier. They do sometimes in Yellow Jackets as well, but I think that Yellow Jackets is much less concerned with the big questions of war and capitalism than Golding and Marina are, and more concerned with individual female social structures. But even with that in mind, Yellow Jackets still functions as an interesting response to Golding, as Lyle is setting out to prove him wrong. While women and girls may have a different experience than men, they're not inherently better. I suppose this brings us back to Elena Schubach at Electric Lit, who pointed out that presenting women as a monolith of good is just as reductive as presenting women as a monolith of stupid, or whatever misogynistic label you want to use there. And so with that in mind, a piece of media like Yellow Jackets does work as a feminist Lord of the Flies, as like Golding's boys, Lyle's girls are layered and messy. Often more layered and messy as they grow into more than Golding's archetypes. Both these archetypes as Golding used them himself, and those archetypes as Lyle decides to use them for her show. For example, Lyle asks, what if Piggy were respected and didn't want to leave the island? Lyle also goes a step further than Golding and asks, what if sex did rear its ugly head? Margaret Atwood, author of The Handmaid's Tale, summed up what I'm trying to get at here pretty succinctly in an interview about The Handmaid's Tale when she said, "Is The Handmaid's Tale a feminist novel? If you mean an ideological tract in which all women are angels and are so victimized they're incapable of moral choice, no. If you mean a novel in which women are human beings, with all the variety of character and behavior that implies, and are also interesting and important, and what happens to them is crucial to the theme, structure, and plot of the book, then yes." I would say the same can be said for Yellow Jackets, but the first half of Atwood's quote works for Lord of the Flies, while the second half decidedly does not. However, I don't think that makes the book less feminist, in the same way I don't think a lack of commentary about war or politics makes Yellow Jackets less feminist. Both have different and unique things to say, and for and about different eras. But when all of these works are taken together, it's just that we have something much more complex and robust than when we only look at each piece individually. But for as much as I like Yellow Jackets even when it's sloppy, it is not, unfortunately, as important a work to me as Lord of the Flies. Why is that? Well, it's because Yellow Jackets doesn't have much, if anything, to say about...
Where the fuck is Natalie?
I've already covered this topic in small pieces in the past few parts, so hopefully this section will be a little bit shorter. During the introduction, I mentioned that reading Lord of the Flies in 2021 made me think about COVID. To expand on that, I was really struck by something Piggy says to Ralph about halfway through the novel when things are falling apart. Not of the beast. I mean, I'm scared of that too. But nobody else understands about the fire. If someone threw you a rope when you were drowning, if a doctor said take this because if you don't take it you'll die, you would, wouldn't you? I mean, of course I would. Can't they see? Can't they understand? Without the smoke signal we'll die here. Look at that. A wave of heated air trembled above the ashes, but without a trace of smoke. We can't keep one fire going. And they don't care. And what's more... He looked intensely into Piggy's streaming face. What's more, I don't sometimes. Supposing I got like the others. Not caring. What would become of us? I won't spend time on the obvious connection this has to vaccines and such because it's obvious and interesting, but rather I want to focus on the attitude Piggy's calling out here. A pervasive disregard from the boys concerning anything remotely intelligent, forward-thinking, or logical. an unwillingness to listen to people who are dedicated to making things better and solving problems, but at the same time, an eagerness to blame those same people for not solving the problems by themselves immediately. Piggy is so obviously right, so obviously logical. He, and the reader, can hardly fathom why the boys wouldn't work with him. And yet, this is exactly how people are, on a small scale and on a large scale, which is precisely how and why fascism thrives, particularly in times of crisis. None of the boys want to listen to Piggy or Ralph about the fire, but they weep when the fire goes out and frame Piggy and Ralph as the enemy. This reminds me of people I know in real life who refuse to follow any sort of procedure, whether that be distancing, vaccines, or whatever, during COVID, and became deathly ill, but were then very quick about rushing themselves to the hospital. They wouldn't trust science to protect them, but they trusted and then benefited from that same science to save them, just like Golding's boys. Piggy and Ralph are ostracized for their focus on the fire, but the boys get rescued solely because of the fire. Jack eagerly pushes them aside so that he can be chief. But when shit hits the fan and the Navy arrives to save the boys and an officer asks who the boss is, this is the best that we get from Jack. A little boy who wore the remains of an extraordinary black cap on his red hair and who carried the remains of a pair of spectacles at his waist started forward, then changed his mind and stood still. And from Ralph,
I am.
After this, all of the boys are reduced to tears and silence, ashamed of what they've done now that it's over and they have to face the consequences. This is the same moment Ron Jones gave his students in that auditorium. The illusion of power is shattered, and now it's time to take responsibility. But of course, no one wants to take responsibility when things have gone wrong, only when they're going right. This is the ultimate difference between Jack and Ralph, the ultimate difference between a good leader and a bad one. Fascist leaders, demagogues, authoritarians, whatever label you want to use, regularly disregard experts because they are the experts. This is why so many authoritarian regimes are subject to brain drains, and the intellectuals who remain do not remain to improve the lives of others, but to enforce the rule of their leader. Fascists cling to a mythical past, promising citizens things they will never get, and denigrating anyone who genuinely aspires to more, such as Piggy. These intellectuals, such as Piggy, often become the scapegoat in the outgroup, subject to retribution and vengeance from the new man in charge. Societies love science when it makes their lives easier. They hate science when it makes them self-reflect. And to be clear, this is not to say that science cannot do things wrong. Keep in mind Tesla's quote of man-made horrors and the destruction of the island at the end of this novel being a metaphor for the use of nuclear or atomic weapons. I think Golding would safely say that those weapons in the real world are examples of man-made horrors beyond our comprehension. But that does not mean that science, like the boys themselves, always has to be used for evil. It can and should be good. But fascists, by contrast, and Jack in particular, thrive because they absolve citizens of guilt or self-reflection. In fact, they discourage self-reflection and double down by telling people they already want to hear and affirming that they have always been right in their prejudices or biases.
I love you guys. You are America. True patriots.
There's a massive billboard I saw once which says something like, "Eat your steak, wear your furs. It's the American way." And this is a perfect microcosm of the populist appeal fascism has. Just as Jack promises the boys they'll be allowed to play and swim and hunt, this billboard, and the political thought process behind it, promises that the status quo is acceptable, preferable, and better than the alternative which considers change. Just as Jack insists rescue is not that important or will work itself out, this billboard argues that anything resembling change or any kind of moderation is silly. There's no need to regard the state of animals as either a resource or as living things. The American way is doing whatever you want, regardless of the consequences, because of course, there are no consequences, just as Jack believes there will be no consequences for the death of Piggy when he asserts, See? That's what you'll get. I meant that. There isn't a tribe for you anymore. The conch is gone. I'm chief.
Everyone's going to be so pleased with you.
Again, he's willing to accept responsibility when it benefits him, but not when it has consequences for him. This is the same line of thought taken by many Nazis during the Nuremberg trials, and one of the ways which some of them, such as Hermann Göring, were eventually forced to admit to guilt.
Would you still follow the Führer? 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 Wo The Fuhrer. Adolf Hitler. Ja. Erfurt.
Fascists are narcissists who want credit where credit is due, but sometimes, when things have flipped, credit turns to blame. And what do you do then? If you're like Jack Meridew, you shrink back into yourself and remain silent when the finger of blame is pointed at someone else. But to avoid getting caught in trivial American politics people will inevitably be pissed off at me for, if they aren't already, I want to tie fascism to the identity of the book as Golding intended by returning to what we previously discussed about the military-industrial complex and how it impacts the island. Just as the feminist reading of the novel is the reading of the novel, so is an environmental reading of the novel the reading of the novel, if for no other reason than it supplements the feminist reading. Remember that the island, and therefore the environment, is feminine. Mother Nature, Mother Earth, are pillaged by the ultimate manifestation of cruel masculinity. War.
What have you boys been doing? Been having a war or something?
When Golding says,
one thing you cannot do with them is take a bunch of them and boil them down, so to speak, into a set of little girls who would then become a kind of image of civilization, of society.
One thing beyond just patriarchy or government here that I think Golding's referring to are militarization and war. Keeping in mind that Golding is a misanthrope who largely views mankind as prone to violence, war is the natural extension and consequence of civilization. As mentioned earlier and summarized by Marina, war is not waged by women. Not that it couldn't be, as we see in Yellow Jackets or The Gracier, and as acknowledged by our friend Elena Schubach when she shouts out Margaret Thatcher. It's just that it historically isn't, as women do not wield the levels of power or industry which culminate in war. Another source that frames what I'm trying to say better than I can myself is former White House Press Secretary George Reedy, who, in his memoir, relates a story about President Lyndon Johnson. When asked by a reporter why Johnson could not withdraw from the war in Vietnam, Johnson allegedly pulled out his penis, which he had nicknamed Jumbo, and cried, "This is why." I don't think I can come up with a clearer parallel between what Golding and Marina are making art about and the real world than this. But regardless of the war, whether it be World War II, Vietnam, or nuclear war, the manifestation of these as patriarchal whims, if not extensions of fascism, and the impact they have on the natural world are universal. The colonist, nationalist way the boys view the island and claim dominion over her is the same attitude exerted by fascists when invading foreign countries to expand their influence, whether that be Vladimir Putin, Adolf Hitler, or, anyone else more recent. I link this to environmental readings of the text because destruction of the natural world is the ultimate consummation of fascism, and Golding uses fascism or authoritarianism as the final form of the military-industrial complex. Informed once more by the horrors of war, the end of Golding's novel is not just individually dystopian for Ralph, but all-encompassingly apocalyptic for the boys. The fire reached the coconut palms by the beach and swallowed them noisily. A flame, seemingly detached, swung like an acrobat and licked up the palm heads on the platform. The sky was black. The island is not just the island, but in Golding's allegory, the entire world, and Jack destroys it in his hunt for Ralph. Keep in mind that he does not need to kill Ralph. Ralph poses no threat to him, and in fact could help him, but nonetheless, Jack destroys the entire island searching for Ralph. And were the boys not rescued, one has to ask, what would Jack have done next? With no food, no fruit, no shelter. Golding explicitly points out that the fire on the island is all-consuming and even burns the pigs Jack so craves. The climax of this, the rescue of the boys, is not even satisfying, but rather pathetic. There's no intelligence or cleverness or craft to Jack burning down the entire island. Rather, the result is simple irony, and the boys being reduced to tears. Not only that, but again, I ask you to remember that Golding is using the boys as a reflection of the wider world. Recall the scene of Roger and Maurice teaching the little ones to kick sand at each other. The boys have learned to play war because it's what they've seen adults do, adults in this case being their fathers. This is why one of the most haunting lines in the story to me is not just Simon's observation of the beast as an inner being, but Piggy's assertion that
we did everything just the way grown-ups would have. Why didn't it work?
If only they could get a message to us, cried Ralph desperately. If only they could send us something grown-up. A sign or something. A A thin wail out of the darkness chilled them and set them grabbing for each other. Then the wail rose, remotely and unearthly, and turned to an inarticulate gibbering. In Chapter 5, Ralph asks for a sign from the grown-up world, and he gets it. It is the unanswered cry of a child in the dark. And so here again, I would like to remind you that when Piggy longs for the adult in the grown-up world, he is not thinking of the same world as the rest of the boys. He is thinking of the feminine world. When the grown-up world arrives to rescue the boys, it's no rescue at all. They're picked up by a warship to return to their war-focused lives in a war-focused world ripped apart by some kind of nuclear conflict, similar to what they just went through on the island.
There are thousands of men on those ships, good, honest, innocent men. They're just following orders.
I've been at the mercy of men just following orders. Never again.
The officer grinned cheerfully at Ralph. We saw your smoke. What have you been doing? Having a war or something? The boys view war as a game because it is a game to their fathers, their leaders, their government, their society. Jack has beaten Ralph in the sense that any of the world's powers could have beaten the others in a Cold War turned nuclear. This resolution always calls to my mind that scene in Alan Moore's Watchmen, when the comedian remarks that, in the event of nuclear war,
That Ozymandias here. Be the smartest man on the cinder.
This is reinforced by the title of the novel itself, Lord of the Flies, translated from Beelzebub. A Lord of Flies is a Lord of nothing. Jack, and fascists like him who are bent on destruction, are the Lord of nothing when the dust settles. Their self-serving interests are self-destructive, as ironically fated to cannibalize them as a character in a Greek tragedy. Or, so we can hope. The existential threat to the natural world, and therefore mankind, in Golding's time was nuclear warfare. This remains a threat today, but it is not a certainty. What is a certainty, however, is climate change. Humans know, and have known, we've known, for years that their actions, our actions, have set us on a path of self-destruction. The science is clear. The piggies of the world have been shouting from the rooftops for decades, while our Ralphs try desperately to make people listen. But nobody's listening yet.
And Chicken Licken repeated, the sky is falling in. But did anyone listen to Chicken Licken? No.
Meanwhile, our Jacks have insisted the threat is either non-existent or will work itself out.
Not global warming. You know, Obama said the biggest problem we have is global warming. And by the way, it's supposed to be 70 degrees today. It's freezing here. Speaking of global warming, we need some global warming. It's freezing. Man.
It's getting big. It must be the air.
It's the wood. It's the rotten wood.
In fact, this is a record cold spell on the whole big section of the United States. It's not just Rochester.
Now, mess this up. Good and proper.
The signal's getting bigger, that's all.
The whole big section. It's like record cold. And I keep hearing about global warming. Now they'll say, he doesn't understand.
It won't spread too far.
So, these people.
Meanwhile, the Jacks of the world, as always, preserve their power by making fun of Ralph and Piggy, while simultaneously relying on them to exist. Let's get lost in trivial American politics for a moment. Another American figure I have deep sympathy for is Jimmy Carter. Unpopular and derided at the time of his presidency, Carter was nonetheless forward-thinking when it came to the environment and energy. He more than doubled the amount of land used for and protected by the federal government in the interest of national parks. He installed solar panels on the White House roof. And when the entire globe was racked by energy instability and catastrophe due to our reliance on fossil fuels, he advocated for Americans modifying their habits to preserve energy and begin looking for a new path forward.
We must not be selfish or timid if we hope to have a decent world for our children and our grandchildren. Many of these proposals will be unpopular.
If you cared so much about the fire, you should have done it yourself.
Along with the shelters and looking after the litlins and organising meetings.
I am a hunter. You're the chief.
You're a failure.
Some will cause you to put up with inconveniences and to make sacrifices.
Who are you, anyway? Sitting there, telling people what to do? You can't hunt. You can't sing.
We had a rule. We keep the fire going.
Bollocks to the rules.
The most important thing about these proposals is that the alternative may be a national catastrophe.
He led by example as well, wearing sweaters in public, lowering the temperature in the White House, and addressing the nation in his famous Malaise speech, where he attempted to be earnest about the threats facing the nation and its soul, similar to Simon's speech when he characterizes the beast as something from inside of us.
But as I was prepared to speak, I began to ask myself the same question that I now know has been troubling many of you. Why have we not been able to get together as a nation to resolve our serious energy problem? It's clear that the true problems of our nation are much deeper than gasoline lines or energy shortages, deeper even than inflation or recession. And I realize more than ever that as president, I need your help.
Maybe there is a beast.
Him! He's got the conch!
What I mean is, maybe it's only us. Nuts!
Like Ralph and Piggy and Simon, Carter was lambasted and rejected by a public who refused to change anything about their behavior or energy consumption. Drive your cars. Burn your oil. It's the American way. Hunt your pigs. Burn your island. It's the British way.
Oh, we're not savages. We're English. And the English are best at everything.
Carter was handily defeated by Ronald Reagan in the election of 1980, and Reagan removed the solar panels from the White House in something that was more than just symbolic. A country which 20 years before had wept at John F. Kennedy's inaugural address and called to
ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country,
was now being told once more that it could do whatever it wanted, regardless of consequence. The United States has seen this exact same model play out through COVID-19 and more recently with the presidencies of Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Coming out of COVID-19, record inflation and high energy costs, Biden, like Carter, tried to think ahead and redirect American behavior. As Ralph and Piggy built huts and kept the signal fire going, Joe Biden invested landmark sums of money in rural infrastructure, development, and green technology. I can attest to these things firsthand. Myself and my community benefited from these policies. And yet Biden, like Carter, like Ralph, was punished for self-reflection and focus on rescue. The American people made it clear they wanted fast, immediate relief on things like gas prices. Never mind gas prices and inflation being raised globally due to an unstable energy market dependent on foreign gas and oil, being regularly manipulated by oligarchs in foreign conflict, or that Joe Biden did everything a president can to lower gas costs by suspending the federal gas tax and releasing millions of gallons of fuel from the strategic reserves, and the idea that investing in long-term building huts on the beach and keeping the fire going just weren't as enticing as short-term lower gas prices for massive American trucks, or the fast, sudden pig that Jack manages to give the boys from his hunts.
This is boring. Playing it nice? It's boring. An adventure island, what do we do on it? Nothing but boring things. Toilets, water, hut building, boring. Well, I don't want this. I never wanted this. I'm forming a new camp. A fun camp, one that hunts and sings and dances. Who's coming with me?
And so in their wisdom, Americans elected Jack chief once again because he promised that they would have fun on the island. Americans are not focused on rescue. Who needs to be rescued when there's no threat? When we drop a boulder on the head of our scientists and burn everything in our hunt for the outgroup.
These people. These people.
We have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities in this country.
No! Jack! You always have to keep talking! Talking!
Hunt the pig, cut her throat, spill her blood. After all, it's the American way. Or maybe it's the human way. Another day, another tale of rape, another ticking bomb to bury deep and detonate. I'm not the only one who finds it hard to understand. I'm not afraid of God. I am afraid of man. To be more succinct, let me return to Golding. In Chapter 4, Ralph sees, or at least believes he sees, a ship on the horizon, which can take them home if it knows they're on the island. Luckily, the boys have started a signal fire, being managed by Jack and his hunters, or so Ralph thinks. He quickly realizes that Jack has let the fire go out, and despite his best efforts, Ralph can neither reignite the fire in time nor get the attention of the ship. When Jack arrives from his hunt with his first successful kill, he has all of the boys who are meant to be guarding the fire with him, and immediately dismisses Ralph's concern over the fire and ship. "We had to have them in the hunt," he said, "or there wouldn't have been enough for a ring." Jack neglects that his pig, while providing the boys with food for a while, would be irrelevant and unnecessary were they simply rescued. In fact, his pig is already unnecessary because the boys can survive on the island's fruit. However, all of Jack's hunters enjoy the thrill of being hunters, of masking themselves in war paint and becoming one single body, while they do not enjoy sitting beside a fire to ensure it stays lit or building huts on a beach. Focused on short-term victory and aggrandizing himself, Jack fails as a leader by ignoring long-term existential threats, being permanently marooned on the island.
You're a failure! You failed!
Connect this to whichever existential threat you want. Nuclear warfare, climate change. In any case, Golding is highlighting the fundamental inability of the autocrat to think ahead, and more importantly, the fundamental willingness of people to follow autocrats in the name of fun and play. In the essay Lord of the Flies as an Allegory, Selene Sathyasaline makes the same case as many other scholars by writing of Jack's followers that they explicitly stand for Nazi followers of Hitler. Golding explains how in the crowd, conscious personalities disappear and members take one in the same direction. Individuals will obey the leader, and like in a trance, he can act in contradiction with his individual character. As Sathyasaline adds later, Jack is nothing other than a minimized figure of Hitler. He is usurper and rules like an autocratic chief. Like Ralph, his leadership quality does not come from his good superior personality, but from his capacity to frighten his followers into implicit obedience. Jack develops his totalitarian state and military regime. He creates a common enemy in order to unite hunters, and his politics are aestheticized through putting some painting on face and garlanding. He is a mini Hitler who has declared Jews as the common enemy, and united Germany under the banner of fascism. Jack soon follows the method of exterminating his friends and follows a Holocaust in which Piggy and Simon are brutally killed. There is much here to unpack about groupthink, cults, and the bystander effect or lack of accountability for the individual within large groups. All of these topics work independently of each other as part of the novel, but each also fits under the manner of fascism, which Golding is trying to explore. Each also fits in neatly with the wave and rhythm zero. Even if you are unwilling to recognize Jack as a representation of authoritarianism, he, like all authoritarians, is an effective cult leader. He removes the boys of their identity, allowing them to hide behind masks to shield themselves from the destruction of the island, the murder of Simon, and the abdication of responsibility. He whips and punishes anyone who dissents, creates a clear out group, and makes decisions based solely on how they benefit himself, not his followers.
The chief has spoken!
He's focused on the short term. He encourages bad behavior and abhors long-term thinking, intentionally blinding anyone who attempts to see into the future, such as Piggy, whose glasses he literally shatters, leading Golding to use the word myopia many times, in both the literal and figurative sense. This myopia on the part of Jack and cult-like devotion from his adherents is what leads them to eventual destruction when they burn the island, culminating in Golding's proverbial retelling of the Christian false story. But I want to be clear here. Jack's form of authoritarian rule is not the only form of authoritarian rule out there. While Jack has rules and slogans and parties and pigs, bread and circuses, this order still stems from a promised lack of control and emphasis on freedom and playing. There is a messy lack of civility to Jack's band, lack of clothing, lack of duties beyond simply hunting, which speaks to a form of hedonism not always present in fascist regimes. Keep in mind the famous phrase regarding Mussolini's fascist Italy and how he kept it under his control for so long, that he kept the trains running on time. In their piece, Did Mussolini Really Keep the Trains Running on Time? Using other sources, Laurie Dove and Nathan Chandler explored the phrase that Mussolini made the trains run on time. In other words, even dictators have their good points. Sure, fascism is an often brutal model of efficient government, full of poverty and corruption, but hey, at least the trains were nearly punctual. But in Mussolini's case, even this point wasn't exactly true. He used pro-fascist propaganda to boost his power and selected the rail industry as an example of a key way in which he'd improve daily life for Italians. While there really were some improvements around the country, in terms of reduced unemployment and investment in infrastructure, this didn't always translate into the supposed perfection perpetuated by propaganda. But in fascist regimes, heck, all forms of regimes honestly, the truth is not really what matters, only the perceived truth, how people feel. This is the classic argument about economics. Jobs and inflation data matter far less than how the average person feels. However, in Jack's regime, trains don't really run on time, figuratively or otherwise. He does deliver the meat and maintain power by making them believe this meat is essential, but it's a ruse. In other words, it's propaganda. They only have the fire they need to cook their meat because they steal it from the scientists. Piggy. Again, like citizens who don't trust science to prevent COVID but trust science to save them from COVID, or people who don't trust science to be accurate about climate change but trust science to be right every time they turn the key of their internal combustion engine, Jack and his band only trust and use Piggy's mind for as much as it is easy and convenient for their own short-term goals. Jack's promise to the island is one of lazy hedonism, not rigid efficiency.
I'm forming a new camp. A fun camp, one that hunts and sings and dances. Who's coming with me?
Yes, he has a hierarchy, himself at the top, supported by Roger, enforced by Maurice, ranks rounded out by the average man, Sam and Eric, and yes, they have uniforms in the sense that they all wear nothing and paint their faces, but it is actually Ralph and Piggy who are more focused on the type of hyper-organization and delegation of tasks which most autocratic regimes build their reputations on. This is not me saying I think Golding's metaphor for fascism fails, or that Ralph and Piggy are the real fascists. As mentioned, the illusion of organized efficiency in fascist regimes is often that, an illusion created by propaganda. But an illusion can be just as important and just as effective, if not more important or more effective, than the truth, than something real. Just see how Jack aggregates power for himself around the perceived fear of the beast, something which does not exist, but which Jack nonetheless promises he will protect the boys from.
This is a present for the monster.
The beast works as a metaphor for any outgroup demagogues have historically enjoyed pointing fingers at: the Jews, communists, racial or ethnic minorities, etc. I think that Golding's allegory works allegorically, but I also think it is interesting and important to compare this allegory to another which it inspired, that being the society Randall Flagg builds in Las Vegas during the events of Stephen King's classic novel, The Stand. King himself is an admitted Golding sycophant and has written on multiple occasions that he would not be, writing anything were it not for his exposure to Lord of the Flies as a child. In his introduction to a 2011 edition of Lord of the Flies, King relates a story from his childhood highlighting his search for something more interesting than his classroom's books for children. As King tells it, he asked his teacher, "Do you have any stories about how kids really are?" King then says of the text itself, "I was thus unprepared for what I found between the covers of Lord of the Flies. A perfect understanding of the sort of beings my friends and I were at 12 or 13. Could we be good? Yes. Could we be kind? Yes again. Could we, at the turn of a moment, become little monsters? Indeed we could. And did. My relief at the last-minute intervention of the adult world was immense, although I was angry at the naval officer's almost offhand dismissal of the ragtag survivors. I stayed angry about that until I remembered that the boys were on the island in the first place because a bunch of idiotic adults had started a nuclear war." All of these thoughts are echoed in King's own work, The Stand, which focuses on a deadly virus, rather than a nuclear war, which wipes out most of the population and leaves the survivors stranded not on an island, but in the United States of America. From there, the survivors split into two groups, one centered in Boulder, Colorado, led by an elderly religious woman, and the other group in Las Vegas, Nevada, led by a charming dark wizard named Randall Flagg. The group in Boulder, who are supposed to be the good guys, are the Ralph and Piggy. They created democracy, ask people for help rather than demand it, and do a lot of self-reflecting. Their enemies, led by Flagg, have a rigid, unelected hierarchy which requires them to swear their fealty and souls to Flagg, with punishment following if they ever disobey or disappoint Flagg. In Flagg's authoritarian Las Vegas, the trains run on time. Everyone goes to work, has a job, clocks in, clocks out, and stays out of trouble.
You want to have a nice life in Vegas, Richie? Good working conditions, retirement benefits?
Sure.
But then don't ask why Flagg does things. That's the best idea, believe me.
Much is made concerning a character in Flagg's Vegas who turns out to be a drug addict and is then executed, as Flagg does not tolerate drug abuse. The drug abuse itself is not really important. What is important is what it represents. Flagg has no time for followers who can't be depended on or who may be subject to sloth. When characters from Boulder eventually reach Las Vegas for the eponymous stand between good and evil, a real Piggy and Ralph carry the conch up the Castle Rock moment, one of the Vegas characters even remarks,
"We haven't got a single addict in Vegas. Can your people say the same?
Mr. Dorgan, even a man of your apparently limited intelligence should be able to see that your experiences with a few battered babies and drug abusers doesn't justify your embrace of a monster.
In fact, a minor plot point in Boulder concerns a drunk who shatters windows on Main Street for no reason, and a kid without a license crashing his car into a building. Like Golding, King creates a clear divide between his Democrats and his autocrats, but King's autocrat is much less hedonistic than Golding's. Flagg's Vegas feels much more Stalinist Russia than Jack's Island, and is much more authentic to our more common, if sometimes inaccurate, view of autocratic regimes. Interestingly, however, when adapting Flagg's Vegas for his 2020 CBS limited series, writer-director Josh Boone removes this element of rigidity and organization from Flagg's empire. Instead, Flagg himself, and those around him, are explicitly hedonistic, engaging in depraved sex and substance abuse. They party, dressed in gaudy clothing which stand in opposition to the novel and 90s miniseries austere suits. Boone's version of King's Vegas is much more reminiscent of Golding's fascism, Jack's Island, and I think that both are interesting, both containing lessons about the appeal of demagogues, authoritarians, and fascists. Remember, at the end of the day, they promise that we are going to have fun on this island. Understand? We are going to have fun on this island. How much fun and what that fun looks like, of course, is subject to change. But what's not subject to change is the conclusion of this fun. Just as Jack's fascism and myopia destroy his island through a figurative nuclear or climate disaster, both King and Boone's Flag destroy his city with a literal nuclear disaster. Hell-bent on eliminating the group from Boulder, Flagg's main focus, and the point of all his trains running on time, is the proliferation of nuclear weapons he can use against Boulder. For this task, he seeks out the character Trash Can Man, a pyrotechnic who finds a nuclear warhead for Flagg. Flagg insists to his followers that if they don't destroy Boulder first, Boulder will destroy them. A lie, of course. None of this matters, though, when Trash serendipitously brings the nuclear warhead to Vegas and it detonates, destroying all of Vegas, Flagg and his followers. Like Jack, Flagg plants the seeds of his own destruction, building on the very Tolkien-inspired British fantasy tradition of evil outdoing itself in the end, a belief that Golding decidedly does not share. Another British author who explores this concept in the same way that Golding does is George Orwell. In his essay looking back on the Spanish War, which is exactly that, a reflection of Orwell's time battling fascists in the Spanish Civil War, Orwell says the following: "But is it perhaps childish or morbid to terrify oneself with visions of a totalitarian future? Before writing off the totalitarian world as a nightmare that can't come true, just remember that in 1925, the world of today would have seemed a nightmare that couldn't come true. We in England underrate the danger of this kind of thing, because our traditions and our past security have given us a sentimental belief that it all comes right in the end, and the things you fear most never really happen. Nourished for hundreds of years on a literature in which right invariably triumphs in the last chapter, we believe half instinctively that evil always defeats itself in the long run. Pacifism, for instance, is founded largely on this belief. Don't resist evil, and it will somehow destroy itself. But why should it? What evidence is there that it does?" This whole thing is a layered and fantastic essay I recommend reading in its entirety, but it is just this section which most closely connects to Golding. Orwell and Golding are both hyper-aware of the constant struggle, not just between good and evil systems, but between the good and evil parts of the self. What sets both of these men apart from their British contemporaries, though, is truly their pessimism. Evil will not always destroy itself in the end, and will indeed never be destroyed, unless good makes an intentional stand. And well, yes, Tolkien and Lewis and Stephen King all make the case that it requires good to stand up to evil for evil to be destroyed in some sense. It won't simply destroy itself. Orwell and Golding are unique in saying that standing up to evil might not always be good enough, and that good might still fail. I should note here that King has also said The Stand is his version of Lord of the Rings. But does King, in all the ways he's been influenced by Golding and Tolkien, share this belief of evil destroying itself? A surface reading of The Stand would say so. After all, rather than an ironic and satirical warship coming to rescue the heroes from a war to bring them to a bigger war, King's conflict ends with a literal hand of God, Deus Ex Machina climax, inspired by his hero's selflessness, detonating the bomb and destroying Flagg. There's nothing more evil outdoes itself than that. But a look beyond the climax and into the denouement of King's text puts it much more in line with Golding and further from Tolkien, especially concerning both authors' warnings about human nature and his proclivities toward fascist annihilation. Two of the only heroes to survive The Stand, Stu and Franny, leave Boulder at the end of the novel in search of something else. Boulder hasn't become bad, exactly, but both characters see the same problems of the old world beginning to start up again there, and don't want anything to do with it. It's very Frodo leaves the Shire for the Grey Havens inspired. In the novel's original ending, Stu and Franny are sitting together on a porch, reflecting on the future, and King concludes his work with a line that I've read on this channel before because it means a lot to me. "Do you think people ever learn anything?" "I don't know," she said at last. She seemed unpleased with her answer. She struggled to say something more to illuminate her first response, and could only say it again. "I don't know." King drives this idea home even less subtly in the expanded version of the text, which concludes with the scene of Randall Flagg being reincarnated somewhere across the world in the final lines, "Life was such a wheel that no man could stand upon it for long, and that always, at the end, came round to the same place again." This is King's warship arriving to rescue his boys from a war and bring them home to a war. But King, unlike Golding, makes the case that, well, yes, evil will always rise. So too will humanity to fight it off. Of course, this is easier for King to say than Golding. While Golding was a part of the fight against fascism, King merely lived in the aftermath of that fight and enjoyed its benefits. However, like Golding, King lived through nuclear proliferation and Vietnam, but managed to avoid misandry to the same degree Golding was consumed by misandry. So did Tolkien. But finally, I would like to conclude this section of fascism and environmental destruction by summarizing what King, Golding, Abramovich, Jones, Marina, and everyone else we've discussed here are exploring with one single word: power. At its core, beneath all of the feminism and allegory, Lord of the Flies is a novel about power. Who has it, why they have it, and who should have it. King explores this with Flagg. Worship me! Abramovich explored it with her crowd, and Jones explored it with his students. In each of these works and for each of these artists, power is represented by something different, but power it remains. And for nearly all of them, the conclusion is that old phrase from Lord Acton, that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. One of our only authors who stands in opposition to this quote would be Kim Leggett in The Gracier, where power is also prominent, but the power that the characters believe exists turns out to be fake, and the realization that the power is fake is what leads the characters to improve their own lives uncorrupted. Interestingly, though, I don't think that Golding himself is making this case in Lord of the Flies. Similar to Leggett, Golding doesn't see power as something that has to corrupt, though it often does if left unchecked by society, civility, and rules. "The rules!" shouted Ralph. "You're breaking the rules!" "Who cares?" Ralph summoned his wits. "Because the rules are the only thing we've got." But Jack was shouting against him.
Bollocks to the rules! We're strong, we hunt.
"If there's a beast, we'll hunt it down. We'll close in and beat and beat and beat." Jack uses his power to flout the rules in a very Randy and Ubermensch manner, but it is not his disregard for the rules which give Jack power. Rather, Golding makes it clear that his disregard for the rules is what ultimately destroys him. His lack of care about the fire remaining contained, or even lit, is what leads to the island's destruction, his eventual rescue, and end of his chieftainship. Piggy reiterates this in what Golding paints as a positive portrayal of power wielding when Piggy decides he's going to confront Jack over Jack's theft of Piggy's glasses. Piggy paused for a moment and peered around at the dim figures. The shape of the old assembly, trodden in the grass, listened to him. "I'm going to him with this conch in my hands. I'm going to hold it out. Look, I'm going to say, you're stronger than I am and you haven't got asthma. You can see, I'm going to say, and with both eyes. But I don't ask for my glasses back, not as a favor. I don't ask her to be a sport, I'll say. Not because you're strong, but because what's right's right. Give me my glasses, I'm going to say. You got to." And that's exactly what Piggy does. Together, he and Ralph take the conch to the top of the castle rock to confront Jack, holding an item of power between them so they have strength while doing something inherently right, something inherently good. Metaphors and symbols abound in this, yes, but in its simplest form, this is the story of a kid being bullied, standing up to his bully to get his glasses back. And while Golding's hero, this child, Piggy, is unsuccessful and never regains the power he lost, King would make the case that all that matters is that Piggy stood. Piggy's language in the scene echoes another classic work of British literature, T.H. White's 1958 novel, The Once and Future King, which collects stories White wrote in the 30s and 40s. Retelling the story of King Arthur, White is similarly concerned with power and spends much time dissecting the idea that might makes right. The wizard Merlin teaches a young King Arthur that this is not a good philosophy of leadership, but that this might-makes-right attitude is nonetheless one which pervades the novel through its villains and, indeed, is pervasive in every fascist and autocratic regime, including Jack's. But another important element of the once and future king that Golding is borrowing from in neighborly British fashion is an item of power being destroyed by the fall of man. In Golding's story, the conch, and in White's story, the sword Excalibur. Or, to be clear, Golding is really borrowing this idea from Sir Thomas Malory, who sees Sir Bedivere throw Excalibur back to Lady of the Lake at the end of his 1400s novel retelling the story of Arthur, Le Morte d'Arthur, though of course Malory was French, and Malory was of course borrowing from the authors who wrote about Arthur before him, authors who were of course borrowing from popular mythology and folklore which was of course inspired by religious texts. You get the idea. King Arthur, Excalibur, British symbol of excellence, purity, and civilization. Arthur dies, the kingdom falls to barbaric ruin, and the item of power is lost. This idea, that power is good only when wielded by good men, and good men are defined by their willingness to give up good power, is reinforced by a series of prominent British literature from the modern era, with only one of these examples being Lord of the Flies. Two of Golding's contemporaries, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, managed to work Malory/White's rejection of power as a defining characteristic of goodness into their works, Tolkien much more explicitly than Lewis. Though, in case you were wondering, in his biography of Golding, John Carey notes that C.S. Lewis not only read Lord of the Flies, but liked it, with Lewis calling it a brilliant success. Unfortunately, Carey never tells us what Tolkien thought of Golding, likely because Tolkien never said, or if he did, I've been unable to find what he said. This is unfortunate because Golding's treatment of power and the items which hold it, compared to Tolkien's treatment of the same, stand in clear contrast to each other, despite exploring some of the same essential questions. For Tolkien, the One Ring is an item of power not to be used or played with. It is a weapon of temptation, not a tool of mankind's betterment. Tolkien's ring in The Lord of the Rings corrupts all who wear it, to greater or lesser degrees, even the seemingly infallible Frodo and supposedly pure Boromir. The only way to handle such a power, Tolkien says, is to destroy it, which is exactly what his hero, Frodo, does. Tolkien is being unequivocal here. Having lived through both world wars and fought in the first, as Golding fought in the second, Tolkien has a fear of centralized power in the hands of anyone other than the Almighty. For Tolkien, absolute power does indeed corrupt absolutely. The ring is not a symbol for civilization. It is the end of civilization. Compare Tolkien's biblical climb up the mountain to Golding's. Both stories see two friends carrying an item of power up a mountain to confront a great evil, and in both stories, the item of power is destroyed. But for Golding, this destruction is tragic, as his conch represents the potential of mankind and civilization. It also represents femininity. The conch is not destroyed because it's dangerous and tempting. The conch is destroyed because it is unnecessary for evil to follow the rules. Even when held in the right hands for Golding, power is not enough if it is unyielded and unheeded. The conch doesn't tempt Jack because Jack doesn't need it. He is the beast in a way Sauron is not Boromir or the Ring. Compare this to C.S. Lewis, where the power is magic, the magic of Narnia. The characters, all four Pevensies and their allies, are given the power of royalty, the magic of Narnia, the blessing of Aslan, however you want to look at it, and all of them have to give this power, this magic, this blessing up. Of course, Lewis is the most overtly religious in his writing out of these three British gents, which is really saying something when your fucking opponents are William Golding and J.R.R. Tolkien, but like Tolkien, Lewis concludes that power is best used and best serves others when held in the hands of the Almighty. Golding, I think, raises the case that the Almighty has given us power, and we will do with it what we will, often, unfortunately, using that power to create man-made horrors beyond comprehension. Despite being a religious man, Golding's theocracy is not nearly or neatly defined as his contemporaries, nor is he building on the Arthurian tradition so cleanly. Arthur is, of course, a Christian figure in the same way Tolkien and Lewis's heroes are, but the closest Golding gets to a religious hero in his text is Simon, who only holds the conch once and promptly has it taken from him when the boys do not understand what he's trying to say about the beast, and Jack interrupts him by saying what I have always interpreted to be the word fuck, in response to Simon's question about what's the dirtiest thing there is. There's lots of feminist inferences you can make from that section as well. Stephen King, though American, follows in the tradition as well, with his item of power being literally the least subtle symbol in the world, a nuclear warhead. In fact, King is so unsubtle that calling it a symbol is disingenuous. It's not a symbol for anything. It just literally is what it is. And I guess you can see it as a symbol of power vaguely, but King is clearly on his usual business about nuclear equal bad. And in this context, he's right. So when King's item of power is removed, it takes evil with it, as it was evil which brought it into the world. The heroes never want to use this power. They want to escape it before it's used against them. Unlike Jack, Flag fears this item of power because he knows what he's planning to do with it. Unlike Jack, Flag needs this power to achieve his goals. This need destroys him, while Jack's lack of need, or respect, destroys him. We have a similar dynamic in Kim Leggett's The Grace Year, where the girl's rejection of the imagined power is what allows them to be free of the curse of that power. So in each of these works, our British and some American author friends are destroying items of power, and they all have the same reason to, except for Golding. This is not me saying that Golding is pro-centralized or aggregated power or pro-fascism. It is just me saying that Golding views power and where it comes from differently than his contemporaries. For Golding, fascism and the destruction which accompanies it are the logical conclusion of patriarchy and militarization. It is only society, represented by the conch and all of its yonic, labial feminine power, which stand between man and the barbaric state of fascism. I believe that Golding sees men as weak almost by default, only having true power when they choose to use it for good. This is why, rather than being subject to regimented uniforms and micromanaged labor, Golding's fascists are barbaric monsters. Because fascism, removed of its propaganda and veneer, its rules and uniforms, is inherently barbaric. And really, there's nothing else for Golding, or myself, to say on the matter. I know what you're thinking. This has been more of a critical analysis of the book than a justification of what makes it the most important book to me. But it would be impossible for me to explore what makes it important without all this analysis. But let me also be clear. It is not the analysis and details which make this book important. It is not the depth of readings and complexity of theme or content which makes it important. These things make it literary, yes, but important? Not quite. Instead, I think this book's important for the reasons I laid out at the beginning and hopefully throughout this video. That every time I read it, it's like reading it for the first time. The world around the book has changed immensely since 1954, and yet it hasn't really changed at all. The things Golding was afraid of 70 years ago are the same things that I'm afraid of now. The problems of politics and the human heart he explored 70 years ago are the same problems that we have now. We still have nuclear weapons. Now we have climate change too. We still have demagogues. We still have authoritarians. We still have people willing to stand idly by while others are hurt. We are still a myopic species hell-bent on our own destruction. We still have rampant militarization and systems built exclusively to perpetuate war. We still have people who deny science the authority to encourage change but beg science to save them. We still mistreat the people who contribute the most to society. We still do all of the things Golding said we do because despite 70 years of renown and classroom instruction, nobody listened.
Jack! Why do you always have to keep talking? Talking! You don't have to conch it. No one has to listen. Do not hit him again.
Instead, we've boiled this book down to the palest mutation of itself possible. It has been disregarded as flimsy allegory with rigid archetypes. We force kids to think about symbolism when we should be asking them to consider whether they would have killed Simon. Lord of the Flies is a commonly banned book, largely due to its pessimism and negative themes. The book is an affront to Puritan people who believe that they have a right to do whatever they want, that any assertion to the ugliness of mankind or civilized society is wrong and unnatural. I would ask them what is right or natural about the Holocaust, the dropping of nuclear bombs on Japan, the forced removal of native groups. Golding is clumsy at times, yeah. He was a tortured man who felt he had done a lot of things wrong and hated himself. He took these feelings out on other people and projected onto his characters. Nonetheless, I think that we have much to learn from him. As John Kerry writes, the book was described as a most significant novel, worthy of survival as a work of art, a work of universal significance, as well as poignant, credible, and terrifying. I think these are all true, but I would also add timeless, and of course, important. It may be my own bias and experience which leads me to see Lord of the Flies as the most important book, but even if it is, so what? Like I said before, this is the most important book to me, because I see this book everywhere. It doesn't have to be the most important book to you, but I spend every day working with students, trying to teach them, trying to teach them something. And yet, some days, I look around the room and feel like I've accomplished nothing. When I read AI essay after AI essay, despite all of the resources and help I've given the students to support their writing, I wonder what the point is. When I consider that the goal and purpose of education is to improve the world, and then think about how little has changed in this world since Golding's time, I have to wonder what the point is. When I meet my students' parents and hear the horrible things that they say about me, about the school, and about my fellow teachers, and I see the way they treat their own children, I wonder what the point is. Some days it feels like every single thing in our culture is hardwired against improvement, against reflection, and against growth. And it gets hard. It gets hard to care about the conch. It gets hard to care about the fire. I feel like Piggy when he says, "What's more, I don't sometimes. Supposing I got like the others, not caring. What would become of us? Sometimes I just don't care what becomes of us. I don't. Sometimes I try to console myself by reminding myself that the problems I have in my classroom are minor compared to the real problems of the world. But considering the real problems of the world is even more depressing. I tell myself I deal with these little problems in the classroom so they don't become big problems in the real world every day, but they still do. They still do. What the kids do, they do because they see their parents do, their leaders do. It's why things are the way they are, which is what Golding has been telling us for 70 years. But nobody listened. Not really. And yet, I won't ignore the fact that there is a Ralph, there is a Piggy, and there is a Simon in the world, in every group of boys, in every group anywhere ever. We don't have to be bad. We can be good. We can be kind. We can be better. And in a lot of ways, we are better than we were during Golding's time. But Golding and King and Jones remind us that we can lose those improvements at any moment, that in fact we are losing them and are going to lose more if we don't stand, if we don't fucking do something. But Golding also shows us how we can confront the beast. Things don't have to break up. The hearts of men do not have to fail. Power does not have to corrupt. I know this. Mankind has stared into the abyss before and managed to look away. I'm not going to pretend that my modern malaise is the same as Golding's post-World War II malaise. I don't understand what Golding went through, but I understand how he felt, and I think that's why his work resonates with me so much. I am partly insane. I'm unreasonable. I know this. It is not appropriate for me to respond to every minor inconvenience and every major catastrophe with the thought that if everyone just read Lord of the Flies and understood it, none of this would be happening. But it gets to a point, man, when so many problems that Golding pointed out about the world compound and explode in endless fucking misery that I have to wonder, what if we had just listened? Listened to Golding, yeah, but to everyone else just like him who have tried to teach us the same lessons about power and destruction over and over and over and over again. Ron Jones, Marina Abramovic, J.R.R. Tolkien, Kim Leggett, Marina, and a million other artists and just real people all across human history who have tried reaching through the years and across the generations to tell us don't do what we did.
Bollocks to the rules. We're strong, we fight meat,
Instead, these artists and activists have increasingly become our Cassandra, giving us a warning we martyr them for. There is a reason fascists hate art and punish intellectuals. Jack will always exile Piggy. It's just what he does because we let him. However, as Tolkien, Leggett, and Marina remind us, we can leave things better for the next group, the next generation. We don't have to let Jack banish Piggy. We don't have to live in a man's world the way Golding and Marina portray it, but we can live in a peaceful world, the way Tolkien portrays it. Before we conclude our time together, I want to mention, briefly, I promise, one last British artist. This one isn't an author. He's not even a contemporary of Golding's. He's a contemporary of us. And he is, of course, British pop superstar Harry Styles. In his new album, Styles has a song called Are You Listening Yet? The chorus of the song speaks to me from beneath all of its poppy glamour. Now you're all out of choices. Are you listening yet? Between your head and heart and somewhere else instead. Oh, can you hear the voice, the one inside your head? Oh, are you listening yet? Oh, are you listening yet? It speaks to me, and it reminds me of Simon, of the voices we all have in our head which assure us everything is a very bad business. Our world, like Golding's boys, reject Simon when he tries warning them and us about the beast. The boys laugh and swear and play, but Simon was right, and no one listened. To conclude, Golding's work is not just about the boys. The island is not just an island. It is the world, the natural, feminine world, and the society we've built on it. When the island is destroyed, that is, as Tolkien would say, the end of all things. It is an apocalyptic novel. It is a dystopian novel. It is not an adventure novel. On the back of her graphic novel adaptation, Amy DeJong sells the story by highlighting its influence. Before The Stand and The Hunger Games, before Battle Royale and Yellow Jackets, there was Lord of the Flies. I don't mention this to legitimize the novel's literary influence or status. I mention it to remind you how many other stories and artists are exploring the same ideas as Golding, and the list could easily go on. Nearly all of these stories are apocalyptic and dystopian in their own right, but I think Golding's work is unique in the way it explores an apocalypse of the soul. An apocalypse of the soul that manifests in a genuine apocalypse for its characters, and will for us too if we allow it. It's not just about archetypes on an island. The story is a genuine warning about what the worst parts of our society will do if left unchecked. It is also an exploration of where those parts, that beast, come from. And even if you don't agree with Golding's exploration or explanation of the origin of that beast, or don't like the way he writes about it, I think that you would be foolish to deny its existence. Golding's boys didn't listen, but we still can. So are you? Are you listening yet?